Hey everybody, this video is called So Long Gentlemen, and tonight we're wrapping up our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Samuel, where we're going to be looking at the deadly battle of Saul and his sons. And so we've been passing through the book of 1 Samuel, if you've been with us the whole time, since August 29th. So we'll be moving into another study this upcoming week. But in 1 Samuel chapter 31 verse 1, it starts out, "Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa." And as you're going to see next week, as I've mentioned in the very opening of our study here, that 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel, they go together. And as you're going to see in 2 Samuel chapter 1 next week, Saul is killed here, and David will not find out about it until the very next chapter. And Mount Gilboa was the former site of the Israeli camp, and it was turned into the site of the Israeli massacre. And Saul and his sons, they lost their lives on it. And here's the fulfillment of chapter 28, as Saul sought the medium to hear from Samuel, and he gathers the judgment of death for him and his sons. And here we are at the very next day after that situation. And in verse 2 it says, "Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons." So we see here that 3 out of the 4 sons of Saul were killed in the same day of the battle. And the 4th son was Eshbaal, also known as Ishbosheth, which I don't like that name, but we're going to be seeing that name quite often as we open up our next study. You know, Eshbaal was absent from the battlefield, and his name meant man of shame. And in chapter 14, verse 49, Jonathan, Ishri, and Malchishua were named sons, but Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua are named here. So Ishri and Abinadab, therefore, are one and of the same. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 33, and 1 Chronicles 9:39, these are the only verses that are naming all 4 sons. And yes, their death was tragic, yet it was important for God's will, as it cleared the pathway for David to take over the monarchy to become the king for Israel. And we'll see David deal with Ishbosheth next week in 2 Samuel chapter 2 verse 8 through chapter 4. And verse 3 through 6 says, "The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me.' But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on the sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together that same day." And so we see that Saul is severely wounded as he is struck with many arrows. And at this point, Saul knew that the battle was lost. He had no hope. And we see that he goes into asking his armor-bearer to just finish him up. You know, "Don't let me suffer, just let me die." And when we see that the armor-bearer fails to do what Saul asked of him, we see that Saul commits suicide. And, you know, I'm going to call it suicide because that's how I see it. There might be some who believe this is not suicide, like Arminian theologian Adam Clark. He argued that he does not consider this suicide, as Saul was critically injured, and that he did so under the conviction that he couldn't survive. And, you know, I think that's where today we see the birth of patient-assisted suicide among the talks among us. And we're going to discuss next week on the other account of the battle testimony, and we'll go into the details on that, and we'll determine which side of the story is true here. But uncircumcised men, as you know, may be a common term that was used as a mockery type among the Israelites to designate the non-Israelites. And you may know circumcision was given as a sign of the Abrahamic covenant back in Genesis 17, verse 10 through 14. And when the Philistines got Saul, I'm sure they tortured him. I don't think that the Philistines took it easy on Saul. And Saul's suicide, what you must realize, was not an act of heroism, but an expression of faithlessness towards God at this moment of his life. And in verse 6, all his men doesn't mean that all of his men, 3,000, died that day with no escapes. And when you study the Bible, you have to realize that all does not always mean all. And I know some jaws are going to drop when I say that. But typically in that case, there is more structure given the show, such as Joshua 8:22, where the author stated they slew them until no one was left of those who survived or escaped. So typically when all means all in the Bible, you're going to see a longer description to it, just like Joshua 8:28. And we're also going to see next week in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 8, that Saul's general of his army survived. So if all meant all right there, then we have a contradiction, because Saul's general survived. And all here means those who were personally assigned to Saul's special guard. In verse 7, it says, "And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley, and those who were on the other side of the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled. And the Philistines came and dwelt in them." So the Philistines' victory caused the other side of the Jordan to flee in fear as panic spread in regards to their king being taken down. And Saul's sin, Saul's hardened rebellion, and eventual ruin affected more than himself and his immediate family. It endangered the entire nation of Israel. And that is how much impact, when you are in a very important role, whether a political leader, a church leader, you have an impact on so many people. In verse 8 through 10, "So it happened the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. And they put their armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of Beth Shan." So this is a similarity between the death of Saul and the death of Goliath. And you see, the giant champion of the Philistines had his head cut off by David, and the Philistines fled, as we saw back in 1 Samuel 17, verse 51, just a few weeks ago. And the Philistines, they had taken revenge and done likewise to the giant champion of Israel, King Saul, as we find in the chapter 10:23, was taller than any of the people from the shoulders upward. And Saul's death was used to glorify the pagan gods and to mock the living God of Israel. And the Ashtoreths were the fertility goddess of the Canaanites, to whom the Philistines gave honor by placing the weapons of their defeated foe in the temple of the Ashtoreths. And as the sword of Goliath was put into the house of the Lord behind the ephod in chapter 21, verse 9, so was the weapon of Saul that was taken by the Philistines put into this temple of the Ashtoreths. And military victory was attributed to the gods, since their belief that military encounters were battles between the deities of the rival nations. And Beth Shan was in the Jordan Valley, that was approximately 16 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. and they fastened Saul's body to the wall, which would have been considered an assaulting thing within that culture, and it was seen as worse to be publicly humiliated rather than death itself. And so to wrap up the verses in the chapter, says, "Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and traveled all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. And they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days." So Jabesh Gilead was east of the Jordan, and its people stayed out of the war against Benjamin and suffered severe consequences as the result, as we saw back in Judges 21. And the men showed kindness and respect to Saul, who was also a Benjaminite, by rescuing his body from the wall of Bethshan. And that's because Saul and his sons had saved Jabesh back in chapter 11, verse 9 through 12 from the Ammonites. And that was just after Saul was chosen king of Israel. And by this act, they honored Saul for his faithfulness to them. And in light of Saul's head being cut off in mutilation, the citizens of Jabesh Gilead burned his body to hide the damage. And it was considered disrespectful to not bury the dead at this time. And in the Hebrew culture, fasting, as you find in the Old Testament, is often associated with death and mourning. And it's to show a sign of respect and seriousness and grief to the one who has passed. And in 1 Samuel, it began with the Ark of the Covenant being captured by the Philistines, if you recall, back in chapter 4, verse 11. And in the end, the Israel's king had been killed by them. And looking ahead, as we move into our next study, Lord willing, 2 Samuel is going to recount how God vindicated his honor by David's defeating of the Philistines in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 17 through 25, establishing the uncontested kingdom in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 12, and safely bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, which is God's city. And so to wrap up the video today, we see that the battle turns against Israel, where Saul and his sons are killed. It's going to bring a whole nation to their knees. And we see the effects it held on the others across the river even. It brought fear upon those to the east of the river, up upon, from the Philistines. And just like King Saul's fatal moments led God's people into fear, we see Jesus use the same principle that would be used against his own disciples. And you're probably like, what are you talking about? I want to go over to Mark chapter 14, verse 27. And so this section of scripture, Jesus predicts Peter's denial. And verse 26 will start out. "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, 'All of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.'" And leaders are so important in structure. When leaders fall, the fall endangers more than just themselves and their immediate family. It affects everything as a whole. And I want to look at 1 Timothy chapter 3. We see the leadership principle in the new covenant here. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 and 2 says, "This is a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop," or some translations will use the word elder, "he desires a good work. A bishop must then be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, and of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, How can he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall in the same condemnation as the devil. And so the New Testament, we see that the call for church leadership, they are given a very high standard for leaders. And it even says that they must be blameless for just cause before the world in God's people. And the Greek word that's used for blameless here is anepiloptos, which means unrebukable. There should be nothing found that they can be rebuked for. You know, they should have a good character view to them. And we saw that the Philistines, they disgraced the corpse of the king and his sons. And we see in the end where the men of Jabesh Gilead are good friends, and they end the disgrace that came upon Saul and his sons as they were being humiliated among the enemies of Israel. And I just want to thank you for joining me this fall season, the last few months in the book of 1 Samuel. I hope that you are with me next week as we start digging into 2 Samuel. And I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.